It was a chilly Saturday morning when I suggested to my wife that we should head out to visit my grandparents. It had been a few weeks since I'd last seen them, and while they always told me not to feel obligated, that they didn't need fussing over, I couldn't help but feel the tug of guilt. They'd raised me as much as my own parents had, maybe even more if you counted the wisdom and life lessons they'd tried to pass on over countless family dinners and lazy Sunday afternoons. My wife nodded, but I caught the slight hesitation in her eyes as she pulled on her jacket. She'd never been entirely comfortable with them, I knew that. My grandparents had old-fashioned ways and could be blunt, not exactly her style. But I appreciated that she was willing to come along. We barely spoke as we climbed into the car, our breath fogging the windows as the engine warmed up. The drive itself was familiar, winding through the empty streets and past rows of houses with fading fall decorations. Trees, their leaves gone to rusty reds and oranges, lined the road like they were standing guard. My wife was quiet, her gaze fixed on the scenery flashing by. I tried to make small talk, asking about her week, if she wanted to do anything special later, but her responses were short, almost distracted, and eventually I just let it fall silent. As we neared the nursing home, my stomach knotted. I'd always hated the place, hated the thought of them being in there. My grandparents were people of independence, resilience, and pride, but age had crept up on them like a thief, stealing away the vitality I remembered so well. It was only after my grandmother's fall last winter that they agreed to move somewhere with round-the-clock care, and as grateful as I was that they were safe, I couldn't shake the unease every time I walked through those doors. We pulled into the lot, a gray concrete slab surrounded by a fence that did little to block the biting wind. The building itself was stark, with wide, looming windows that seemed to glare out at us as we approached. My wife shifted in her seat, fiddling with her purse strap, as if the very sight of the place made her uncomfortable. She shot me a tentative smile, and I tried to return it, hoping to reassure her, or maybe myself, that this would just be another normal visit. Inside, the nursing home was quiet, that odd, unsettling silence, broken only by the distant drone of a TV or the occasional shuffle of a resident's walker on the tile floor. The place had an antiseptic smell, mingling with faint hints of stale coffee and something vaguely metallic, a smell that seeped into your clothes and stayed with you long after you'd left. We stopped at the front desk, where a nurse with a practiced smile handed us visitor badges and gave us directions. My wife stood back, her eyes darting around, her discomfort clear. I reached out, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. She managed a thin smile in return, but didn't relax. We took the elevator up to the third floor, passing residents in wheelchairs and a few staff members bustling from room to room. Each hallway looked the same, long beige walls lined with faded landscape paintings, doors numbered in bold type like rows in some strange library. The sounds were subdued, muffled voices, and the hum of machinery from distant rooms, a quiet that pressed down on us as we made our way toward the wing where my grandparents stayed. We finally arrived at the common area, where my grandfather usually spent his afternoons. He was sitting in a cushioned armchair, his face hidden behind an old magazine. For a second, I just watched him, feeling a pang of nostalgia for the man he'd been, the man who used to toss me in the air when I was a kid, who'd helped me build a treehouse in the backyard, and who always had a mischievous twinkle in his eye, like he was about to let me in on some grand secret. But now he looked small, swallowed by the chair, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of all those years had finally caught up to him. He hadn't noticed us yet, and I took a moment to steel myself, to put on a smile and brush aside the sadness that always lingered just beneath the surface when I saw him like this. "Hey, Grandpa," I said softly, stepping forward. He looked up, his face breaking into a smile, and for a moment that spark was back. "Well, if it isn't my favorite troublemaker," he said, reaching out for a handshake. His grip was weaker than I remembered, but his spirit was there, shining through in his eyes. My wife hung back, offering a polite nod. "Hi, Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice a little tight. He grinned, his expression softening as he glanced over at her. "Ah, come on now, call me Frank," he replied, giving her a wink that seemed to catch her off guard. I tried to ease the tension with some small talk, asking about his day, if the staff was treating him well, if he'd been watching any of his favorite old westerns lately. He answered with his usual humor, making cracks about the food and grumbling good-naturedly about the nurses who, in his words, fussed over him like he was some old geezer who couldn't tie his own shoes. It was the same line he'd been saying for years, even when he'd been the one who decided he needed help. After a few minutes, I felt a familiar restlessness creep in. I wasn't used to staying still, especially in this place, and part of me was itching to stretch my legs, maybe take a quick stroll down the hall. I looked over at my wife, who was standing off to the side, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked like she was about to jump out of her skin, her eyes darting around the room as if she were trying to find a way to escape. "Hey, I'm going to take a quick walk around," I said, nodding towards the door. "Stretch my legs a bit." She shot me a look, one of those, "Are you really leaving me alone here?" expressions, but it was fleeting. She quickly masked it with a small nod and a tight smile. "Sure, take your time," she replied, glancing away. "All right," I said, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze before heading out. I could feel her eyes on me as I left, a strange tension radiating from her that I couldn't quite place. Maybe she just wasn't comfortable here, I thought, trying to brush off the unease that had begun to settle in my stomach. As I walked down the hall, the cold fluorescent light overhead cast a stark glare on the beige walls, washing everything in an unforgiving, sterile glow. I passed a few residents shuffling along, some of them glancing up at me with distant, unfocused eyes. I made my way down to the end of the hallway, where a window overlooked a small gray courtyard, dotted with a few barren trees. The place felt both peaceful and desolate, like a limbo between two worlds. I stood there for a moment, staring out at the empty courtyard, letting the coldness seep into me, trying to shake off the strange feeling that something was off. But as I looked back down the hallway, the knot in my stomach only tightened. Something wasn't right. I couldn't say exactly what, but a faint, prickling sensation was growing at the back of my neck, a feeling I couldn't ignore. With a final glance out the window, I turned and headed back towards my grandfather's room, my footsteps quickening with each step. I could feel my pulse quicken, the quiet dread creeping up as I neared the door, bracing myself for whatever strange, unknowable thing seemed to be waiting just beyond that threshold. My walk down the hall had been short, but it felt like the place had shifted somehow, like the nursing home had breathed in my absence. As I turned the corner to head back to my grandfather's room, I noticed something odd, a faint, hushed laugh drifting from the door. The sound was familiar, almost comforting, but the context made it feel unsettling, even out of place. It took me a second to realize it was my wife's voice, soft and lilting, like she was sharing some private joke. It stopped me dead in my tracks. She wasn't the type to laugh easily, not here, not around my grandfather. Usually, she kept a polite distance, a little stiff and guarded, with that plastered-on smile she wore at family gatherings. But this was different. There was something natural, even flirtatious, in the way she laughed. I felt a strange pang in my chest, a confusing mix of jealousy, worry, and a deeper unease I couldn't name. I took a slow breath, brushing it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe they'd just found something funny in an old family story. Maybe he'd cracked a joke in his grumpy way. Or maybe it was just some kind of nervous reaction on her part. But then I heard him laugh, a low, rough chuckle that sounded much too familiar. My grandfather's laugh was unmistakable, a sound that used to fill the house and echo through our backyard when I was a kid. But now it carried a strange undertone, something intimate. My hands clenched at my sides as I stood outside the door, listening, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. "Come on, you're still a charmer," she said, her tone light, but with an unmistakable hint of something more. I leaned forward, my head swimming as I strained to catch every word. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat hammering louder in the silence of the hallway. "Oh, sweetheart," my grandfather replied, his voice thick with something I couldn't place, something I didn't want to believe. "You've got no idea what I used to be capable of." What was happening in there? A flood of thoughts crashed through my mind, each one more disturbing than the last. I felt my stomach turn, bile rising in my throat as I tried to piece together the scene beyond the door. Maybe I was misreading things. Maybe it was just harmless banter, but the laughter, the tone of their voices, the way he called her sweetheart, like it was nothing. It gnawed at me. I pressed my ear closer, fighting the urge to storm in, needing to know more. And then I heard her again. "Here, let me help you with that," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. There was a rustling sound, and I felt a sharp, instinctive pang of anger, a warning flaring up inside me. This wasn't right. Something was happening, something that had crossed an invisible line. I couldn't hold back anymore. My hand shot out, and before I knew it, I was pushing the door open, my pulse racing, my breath tight in my chest. The door creaked as it swung inward, and I stepped inside, eyes darting from my wife, who was adjusting her blouse, to my grandfather, who was seated in his chair, looking unusually composed. The two of them froze, both turning to look at me with expressions that sent a chill through me. My wife's face went pale, her lips parting in shock, though there was a flicker of guilt there, something that didn't belong. "Oh, you're back," she stammered, her voice wavering as she glanced at me, then back at my grandfather. He just sat there, a faint, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The look of a man who'd just been let in on some twisted joke. I stared at them both, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, of the tension in the room, the way she stood just a little too close to him, the way he seemed so pleased. "What's going on here?" I demanded, my voice a low, dangerous growl, though I could barely keep the words steady. She blinked, stepping back, her hands fumbling at her sides as she searched for words. "Nothing. We were just talking," she said, her voice trembling, too quick, too defensive. "Just talking?" I repeated, the words thick in my throat, because that didn't sound like just talking. My grandfather chuckled, a slow, dry sound that felt like sandpaper against my nerves. He looked up at me, eyes twinkling with something dark, something I didn't recognize. "Come on, kid," he said, giving a slow, deliberate smile. "Don't be so dramatic." "Dramatic?" I spat, my voice rising, barely able to keep the anger contained. I looked at her, my wife, who was staring at the floor, her face flushed with embarrassment, or something close to it. My mind raced, images flashing through my head. Had I just walked in on something I couldn't unsee, something I didn't want to believe? I struggled to understand, to put the pieces together, but all I felt was a growing sense of betrayal, the sick realization that something unthinkable had happened right under my nose. "I leave you alone for 5 minutes," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "And this is what I come back to?" Her gaze snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "No, you don't understand." "Don't understand what?" I interrupted, my voice harsh. "Don't understand that you were, what, flirting with him, laughing, whispering, whatever it was." I turned to my grandfather, who simply raised an eyebrow, his expression smug and unrepentant. He looked at me like I was the one overreacting, like I was too young, too naive to understand. That look, that dismissive, condescending look, set something off in me. "You think this is funny?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my hands clenched into fists. "You think this is some kind of joke?" He shrugged, leaning back in his chair, the very picture of nonchalance. "You're overreacting," he said calmly, as if we were discussing the weather. I turned back to her, a bitter laugh escaping me. "Is this your way of getting back at me?" I asked, my voice laced with anger and something close to desperation. "After everything, you do this, here?" She didn't answer, her silence speaking volumes, and for a moment, the weight of it all crashed down on me. The betrayal, the absurdity of the situation, the realization that the person I'd trusted had crossed a line I hadn't even known was there. I don't even know who you are," I whispered, the words bitter and raw, laced with disbelief. She opened her mouth, as if to protest, but no words came out. She just looked at me, her expression a mix of regret and something else, something I couldn't place. And my grandfather, he simply sat there, watching, as if this were nothing more than some twisted game. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like everything I'd known had been turned upside down. I couldn't stand to be in that room a second longer. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out, the door slamming shut behind me, leaving them both in stunned silence. But even as I walked away, my mind raced, questions and doubts swirling around in a storm I couldn't control. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I stormed down the hall, my footsteps echoing off the cold, tiled floors of the nursing home, each step a barely contained explosion of anger and disbelief. My mind was racing, my vision tunneled, the whole place fading around me as I tried to process what I'd just seen. My wife, my own grandfather. It was like some twisted nightmare I couldn't shake off. I kept walking, needing to put as much distance as possible between myself and that room, away from the sight of them together, the sound of her laughter lingering in my ears like an accusation. My hands were shaking, fists clenching and unclenching as I tried to calm down, to keep myself from tearing the entire place apart. Eventually, I found myself out in the courtyard, a small, open space surrounded by the high, looming walls of the nursing home, with a few lonely benches and a couple of scraggly trees stripped bare by the late fall chill. The air was crisp and biting, but I barely felt it. I was too numb, too lost in the storm of betrayal and rage that churned inside me. I took a seat on one of the benches, gripping the cold metal edges as if I could channel all my anger into them, as if holding on to something solid might keep me grounded. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. Time felt warped and surreal, like I was suspended in some kind of twisted limbo. I could barely catch my breath, each inhale coming in ragged, broken gasps, the cold air searing my lungs as I tried to make sense of it all. I heard the door creak open behind me, and I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Her footsteps were hesitant, almost timid, as she made her way across the courtyard. She stopped a few feet away, hovering on the edge of my peripheral vision, as if she were afraid to come any closer. "Can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. My jaw was clenched so tight it felt like my teeth might shatter, but I kept my gaze fixed on the empty, desolate landscape of the courtyard, refusing to look at her, refusing to give her even a sliver of my attention. She shifted uncomfortably, crossing her arms against the chill, as she waited for me to say something, anything. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, my voice cold and sharp, slicing through the silence like a knife. I still didn't look at her, but I could sense her flinch, the way her shoulders tensed, as if she'd been struck. It's not what you think," she stammered, her voice trembling as she took a hesitant step closer. "I swear it's not what I think," I interrupted, letting out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Then tell me, please, enlighten me, because from where I was standing, it looked like you were getting pretty cozy with my grandfather." She was silent, the words hanging in the air between us like a toxic cloud, thick and suffocating. I could feel her eyes on me, pleading, but I refused to meet her gaze. I didn't want to see whatever expression she wore, Whether it was guilt, shame, or, God forbid, some twisted form of satisfaction. I wasn't sure I could handle it. It wasn't, we didn't, I just... She trailed off, her words stumbling over themselves, each one weaker than the last. Just what? I asked, finally turning to look at her, my eyes blazing with fury and hurt. What were you doing exactly? Playing nurse? Offering him a little extra attention? Giving him something to perk him up? My voice dripped with venom, each word laced with a bitterness that left a foul taste in my mouth. Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing, as she struggled to find an answer. But there was nothing she could say that would make this better. Nothing that could erase the image burned into my mind, the sound of her laughter, the way she'd looked at him like he was something precious, something desirable. "Do you even realize how sick this is?" I continued, my voice rising despite myself, echoing off the walls of the courtyard. "Do you have any idea what you've done? To me, to us? Or did you just, lose yourself in the moment? Forget that he's my grandfather?" She looked down, her hands twisting together as if she could wring out some kind of redemption. But I wasn't about to let her off the hook. I couldn't. "It was just a mistake," she whispered finally, barely able to meet my gaze. "I got caught up, okay? It was stupid, and I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go that far." "Oh, so it went far, did it?" I shot back, my voice dripping with sarcasm and barely contained rage. "Good to know. Glad you're giving me some specifics now." She let out a frustrated sigh, her expression shifting from guilt to something harder, more defensive. "Look, I'm not saying it was okay," she said, her tone sharpening. "But don't act like you're perfect. You've been so distant lately, so wrapped up in your own world. I don't even know who you are anymore. Maybe I was just, looking for some kind of connection." Her words hit me like a slap to the face, leaving a sting that went deeper than I'd expected. "So this is my fault now?" I asked, incredulous. "You're blaming me for what? Not paying enough attention to you? So you decided to get close to my 80-year-old grandfather?" She looked away, her jaw clenched, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, until I couldn't take it any more. "You know what?" I said, my voice cold and final. "I can't do this. I can't stand here and listen to you try to justify what you did. You crossed a line, one I didn't even know existed, and I don't know if I can come back from this." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face as she took a step toward me. "Wait, please don't say that. Don't just give up on us. We can work through this, can't we? I made a mistake, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right. Just, please, give me a chance." But I was already backing away, the hurt and betrayal too raw, too overwhelming to even consider forgiveness. "A chance," I echoed, my voice hollow. "I don't even know who you are anymore. And honestly, I don't think I want to." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the courtyard, the weight of her actions settling on her shoulders like a shroud. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because if I did, I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep myself from breaking all over again.